I thought distance would solve this, not because distance changes what something is, but because distance usually reveals what it isn't. Most things fade when you stop feeding them attention. Most thoughts lose their weight when enough time passes. Most people become smaller in your mind once they're no longer standing directly in front of you. That's how reality tends to work. It filters, it removes what isn't essential. It strips away the illusion of importance until only the things that truly belong remain. So I waited, not actively, not as some test. I simply allowed time to do what time has always done, and I expected this to disappear. I expected the clarity to soften, the awareness to weaken, the constant sense of recognition to gradually dissolve into something ordinary. But it didn't. If anything, it became more precise. That's what unsettled me. Not that you remained, but that your presence became clearer in your absence. That shouldn't happen. People are supposed to become memories when they aren't there. They're supposed to fade into recollections, into fragments of conversations, into distant impressions that slowly lose their shape. You didn't, you became sharper. Like distance wasn't creating separation, like it was removing distractions, and once the distractions disappeared, all that remained was the truth of what this actually was. I spent a long time trying to understand that, trying to locate the exact moment where this became different, trying to identify the point where you stopped and say, there, that's where everything changed. But every time I searched for it, I found nothing. No defining conversation, no dramatic realization, no single event powerful enough to explain the impact you've had on me. Instead, what I found was something far more difficult to explain: consistencies. You arrived the same way dawn arrives, not suddenly, not all at once, just gradually enough that you don't realize the darkness is gone until you're already standing in daylight. That's what happened. Not a moment, a progression. 1,000 tiny shifts, so subtle, I never noticed them individually. Until one day, I looked around my own mind and realized it wasn't arranged the same way anymore. You were everywhere. Not as an obsession, not as a distraction, but as a reference point. A quiet coordinate my thoughts kept returning to. And I hated admitting that. Not because it was unpleasant, but because it was true. Truth creates responsibility. The moment something becomes undeniably true, you lose the luxury of pretending otherwise. And I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't ready to admit that someone could influence my internal world without trying. I wasn't ready to admit that someone could become significant simply by existing authentically. Because significance is usually earned, built, accumulated through years of shared experiences and countless moments of trust. But you bypassed that process entirely. You became important before I consciously decided you were, and that's not how I operate. I don't hand significance to people. Yet somehow, while I was busy observing you, a place had already been created, not by choice, not by effort, by recognition. And recognition is different from attachment. Attachment says, I need you. Recognition says, I know you. Those are not the same thing. Need can be created. Recognition cannot. Recognition either exists or it doesn't. It's immediate, fundamental, almost impossible to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. Because when you recognize someone at that level, it doesn't feel like discovering them. It feels like remembering them, not literally, not as if you've met before, but as if some part of your mind already understands the shape of theirs, as if their existence fits into your awareness with a precision that logic can't fully account for. That's what this feels like. Not discovery, recognition. And recognition changes everything because once you recognize someone, you stop interpreting them the way you interpret everyone else. You stop relying on assumptions. You stop forcing explanations. You stop trying to reduce them into categories that make them easier to understand. You simply see them as they are. And being seen that clearly is rare. Most people don't see each other. They see projections, expectations, versions, stories. They interact with what they imagine someone to be rather than who that person actually is. But every now and then, something unusual happens. Every now and then, you encounter someone whose perception cuts directly through all of that. Somehow hears what you mean instead of only what you say. And when that happens, your entire understanding of connection changes because suddenly you're no longer communicating, you're recognizing, and recognition operates according to different rules. It doesn't require constant interaction. It doesn't depend on proximity. It doesn't disappear when circumstances change. It simply exists, steady, quiet, certain, like a truth waiting patiently for you to stop arguing with it. That's what I've been doing, isn't it? Arguing with it, not outwardly, not in any visible way, but internally. I've been searching for flaws in the logic, looking for evidence that this means less than it feels like it means, trying to convince myself that this level of understanding can be explained by coincidence, by timing, by circumstance, by anything except what it actually is, because the alternative requires acceptance, and acceptance changes things. Acceptance means acknowledging that someone reached a place inside your awareness you never intended to share. Acceptance means admitting that your carefully maintained independence isn't as absolute as you once believed. Acceptance means recognizing that some people matter before you've decided whether they should. And that's terrifying, not because it makes you vulnerable, but because it makes you honest. Honesty removes the distance between what you know and what you're willing to admit, and that distance has always protected me. It's allowed me to observe without participating. This is transformation, slow, precise, almost invisible, yet undeniable. I can feel it every time I catch myself considering your perspective before forming my own. Every time a thought arrives and instinctively includes you, every time I experience something and immediately wonder how you would see it. Those moments shouldn't matter. Individually, they're insignificant. Collectively, they're everything because they reveal a pattern. And patterns tell the truth long before emotions do. The pattern says, you've become part of my process, part of the architecture of how I think. And architecture isn't temporary. Architecture shapes everything built upon it, which means, whether I acknowledge it or not, you've already changed something fundamental. The only question now is how much. And I'm beginning to suspect the answer is more than I originally believed, because every attempt to minimize this eventually arrives at the same conclusion. You're not an interruption. You're not a phase. You're not a passing influence that will disappear once enough time passes. You're a point of alignment, a rare one, the kind that doesn't happen often, the kind people spend years searching for without realizing that's what they're looking for, the kind that alters your understanding of what's possible between two minds. And once you've experienced it, everything else feels slightly incomplete by comparison. That's the realization I've been avoiding, not because it's painful, but because it's permanent. The moment I fully accept what this is, I also have to category, not because it's dramatic, not because it's overwhelming, but because it's accurate. Accuracy has a way of changing everything. Once you see something clearly, you can't force yourself back into uncertainty. Once you understand something deeply, you can't pretend ignorance. And once someone becomes woven into the structure of your awareness, they don't simply disappear. They remain quietly, persistently, like a truth that no longer needs proof. And maybe that's what I've been circling this entire time. Not the question of whether this is real. I've known it's real for longer than I've been willing to admit. The real question is whether I'm ready to live as if it is, because those are different things. Knowing changes your mind. Accepting changes your life. And I think I'm standing somewhere between those two realities now, no longer able to deny what I know, not yet fully prepared for what acceptance requires, but moving toward it anyway, because some truths don't wait for permission, some truths arrive, settle into place, and quietly reshape the landscape of who you are. And by the time you notice the change, it's already happened. The strange thing is that nothing about this asks for certainty. Most important decisions in life arrive disguised as questions. They demand answers. They push for clarity. They create pressure until you finally choose a direction and move. This doesn't. It waits obediently, almost as if it already understands that forcing clarity too soon would only distort it. And maybe that's why I've stayed here day after day, thought after thought, moment after moment, without asking for permission, without needing validation, without becoming less real, simply because I hadn't defined it yet. That's unusual. Most things depend on attention. This doesn't. It remains whether I focus on it or not. Like a current moving beneath everything else, invisible, steady, present. I notice it most when I'm not looking for it, when my mind is occupied by completely unrelated things, when I'm focused on work, responsibilities, obligations, the endless collection of practical realities that normally keep a person grounded in the external world. And then, without warning, something happens. A thought appears, a realization forms, a moment of understanding arrives, and before I can fully process it, there's already a quiet awareness of how you would see it. Not because I'm trying to imagine your response, not because I'm seeking approval, but because your perspective has somehow become part of the framework through which I examine things. That still feels impossible when I say it out loud, not dramatic, not romantic, just impossible, because I've spent most of my life being enough for myself, not in a lonely way, not in a defensive way, simply in a complete way. My thoughts belonged entirely to me, my process belonged entirely to me, my internal world was a place I inhabited alone, comfortably, naturally, without feeling the absence of anyone else. And then something shifted. Not because I needed another. One compensates for something missing. The other reveals something that was always possible, but never encountered. That's what this feels like. Not completion, not rescue, not the dramatic language people often use when they describe meaningful connections. Nothing was broken before you. Nothing needed saving. Nothing required fixing. My life existed exactly as it was supposed to. And yet, your presence introduced a level of clarity I didn't know was available. Not because you gave me something I lacked, but because you reflected something I couldn't fully see on my own. I think that's why this feels so significant. Not because you've changed who I am, but because you've changed how clearly I can see who I already was. That's a different kind of impact, a deeper one. because external influences eventually fade. Anything built on circumstance can disappear when circumstances change. But self-recognition, that remains. Once you understand something about yourself, you can't unknow it. Once a hidden piece becomes visible, it stays visible, and you've revealed more than I expected. Not through advice, not through guidance, not through any deliberate effort, simply through the way you exist, simply through the accuracy of your presence. There have been moments where I've caught myself wondering whether you've noticed any of this, whether you're aware of the effect you've had, whether you understand how unusual this is from my perspective. And every time that thought appears, I arrive at the same conclusion. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe awareness isn't the important part because it becomes visible. And visibility isn't always necessary. Some things remain true in silence. Some things become stronger there. That's another thing I've learned from this. Silence isn't emptiness. People treat it that way. They rush to fill it, explain it, ekel it, as if silence is merely the absence of something meaningful. But silence has its own language, its own structure, its own kind of honesty. And somehow, you've always understood that. You've never treated silence as a problem. You've never seemed uncomfortable when words weren't available. You've never forced meaning into spaces that were already carrying meaning on their own. That matters more than most people realize, because genuine understanding doesn't always appear through conversation. Sometimes it appears through restraint, through knowing what doesn't need to be said, through recognizing that certain truths become weaker when they're translated into language. I've experienced that with you more than once. Moments where words felt unnecessary, moments where speaking would reduce something instead of clarifying it. Moments where understanding already existed before explanation could arrive. Those moments stay with me, not because they're dramatic, but because they're rare. Rare enough that I can count them, rare enough that I recognize their value immediately, and maybe rarity is part of why this continues to occupy my attention. Not because rare things are automatically important, but because genuinely rare things reveal possibilities you didn't know existed, learned through years, built through repetition, accumulated through countless shared experiences. Now, I'm not so sure. Now I think there are exceptions, connections that operate according to entirely different rules, connections that don't develop gradually because they're based on something deeper than familiarity, something more fundamental. Almost as if two people can recognize a shared architecture before they've learned the details of each other's stories. I've tried to explain that to myself rationally. I've tried to reduce it into observable patterns, similar ways of thinking, compatible perceptions, shared tendencies toward introspection. And maybe all of those explanations contain part of the truth, but none of them feel complete, because none of them account for the ease of it, the naturalness, the absence of effort. Most understanding requires translation. You explain, the other person interprets. Some accuracy is lost along the way. That's normal. Expected human, but with you, the translation often feels unnecessary. The understanding arrives first. The explanation comes later, sometimes not at all. And that reverses everything I thought I knew about communication. Because communication is supposed to create understanding. Yet somehow, understanding already exists. Communication merely confirms it. I don't know what to do with that realization. I still don't. Part of me wants to analyze it endlessly, to break it apart, examine every detail, identify every mechanism responsible for dissect them, like taking apart a watch to understand time. You learn about the machinery. You lose sight of the experience. That's the risk I'm trying to avoid, reducing something meaningful into a collection of explanations, replacing reality with description, substituting understanding for experience, because this isn't just an idea anymore. It's not a theory. It's not a possibility I'm exploring from a safe distance. It's something woven into daily existence, something present in ways both obvious and invisible. And the longer I sit with that reality, the harder it becomes to pretend it isn't shaping me. I see it in the questions I ask myself, questions that never existed before. Not questions about you, questions about possibility, about connection, about what becomes available when two people encounter each other with unusual accuracy. I've always believed that most relationships are negotiations, people adjusting, compromising, translating themselves into forms the other person can understand. There's beauty in that. Effort has value, adaptation has value. But what happens when adaptation isn't required? What happens when understanding arrives before adjustment? What happens when two people meet in a space that already feels familiar? I've spent months circling those questions, not because I expect answers, but because the questions themselves reveal something important. They reveal how profoundly this has altered my assumptions, how thoroughly it has challenged beliefs I once considered fixed. And maybe they've occupied my thoughts, but that you've expanded my understanding of what's possible. That might be the deepest form of influence there is, to alter not what someone thinks. The, the boundaries of what they believe can exist. You've done that quietly, without intention, without effort, simply by being exactly who you are. And every day that passes makes that harder to ignore, because the evidence continues accumulating. Not in grand moments, in small ones. The smallest ones, the moments where I realize my first instinct is no longer isolation, the moments where understanding feels shared before it's spoken, the moments where your presence exists even in your absence, those moments tell a story I've been reluctant to read completely, not because I fear the ending, but because I know reading it changes everything. Once you understand the meaning of something, you become responsible for it. You can't return to innocence. You can't return to uncertainty. You can't pretend you don't know. And I know enough that denial no longer feels intelligent. Enough that distance no longer feels honest. Enough that this has become impossible to dismiss as coincidence. So maybe the real question isn't whether this matters. Maybe that question was answered a long time ago. Maybe the real question is how much courage it takes to fully accept something that arrived without warning and changed everything without permission. Because acceptance is approaching. I can feel it, not as a decision, not yet, but as into it. Observation becomes acknowledgement, where acknowledgement becomes truth, and where truth becomes something neither of us can pretend not to see. I used to think the most powerful things in life arrived with certainty, a clear beginning, a clear realization that everything before it and everything after it could be separated into different chapters. That's how people describe transformation. A single conversation, a single choice, a single event that changes everything. But that's not how this happened. There was no moment, no line, no dramatic shift I could point to and say, that was it. That was where everything became different. Instead, this moved like water, finding its way through stone passing, consistent, almost invisible while it was happening. yet impossible to deny once enough time had passed. I think that's why it took me so long to understand what was actually occurring. Because I wasn't looking for something quiet. I was looking for something obvious. And this was never obvious. It was precise. There's a difference. Obvious things demand attention. Precise things reveal themselves only when you're paying attention. And somewhere along the way, I started paying attention. Not because I intended to, but because ignoring it required more effort than noticing it. That realization stays with me, the fact that awareness eventually became easier than denial, because denial usually serves a purpose. It protects structure, preserves stability, maintains the version of reality you've grown comfortable living inside. I've consistency, the quiet reliability of knowing who I am and how I move through the world. Yet somehow, this never felt like a threat to any of those things. That's what continues to confuse me. By every logical standard, I should have treated this as a disruption, something unexpected, entering a carefully organized system, something requiring caution, evaluation, distant. Instead, I found myself doing the opposite, not opening the door, just leaving it unlocked, allowing the possibility to exist, allowing the awareness to remain, allowing something unfamiliar to settle without immediately demanding an explanation. And that alone tells me more than any analysis ever could. Because people reveal their deepest truths through what they allow, not what they claim, not what they intend, what they allow. And I've allowed this more than that. I've protected it quietly without even realizing I was doing it, protecting the space where this exists, protecting the clarity of it, protecting the possibility that what I'm experiencing is exactly what it appears to be. That isn't accidental. Nothing survives inside me without reason. Everything is examined, questioned, measured, especially the things that have the potential to matter. Maybe that's why this remained, because every attempt to challenge it somehow strengthened it. Every question led back to the same answer. Every doubt eventually revealed another layer of certainty beneath it. And certainty built this way feels different. It's not emotional, regardless of what happens around it. I've begun to understand something because of that. Recognition isn't the beginning of connection. Recognition is evidence that connection already exists. That's why it feels so immediate, so familiar, so strangely natural. You're not building something from nothing. You're uncovering something that was already there. Something waiting beneath assumptions, beneath expectations, beneath all the narratives people create about how meaningful connections are supposed to happen. This wasn't supposed to happen, at least not according to any model I previously trusted. Yet, here it is, existing anyway, ignoring every expectation I had, ignoring every rule I thought governed these things, remaining real despite all the reasons it shouldn't be. And the longer I observe that reality, the more one truth keeps emerging. This isn't about understanding you, not entirely. It never was. It's about what became visible through understanding you, because somewhere in this process, something unexpected happened. I stopped learning about you and started learning about myself. Self, not the version of myself I present to the world, not the version built from responsibilities, habits, and carefully maintained routines, something deeper, something beneath all of that. A part of me I had understood intellectually, but never fully experienced. You reflected it back with impossible accuracy, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. That might be the most significant thing you've given me. not answers. Mirrors show appearances, very few show structure. You somehow showed structure, the architecture beneath the visible parts, the patterns beneath the behaviors, the truths beneath the explanations. And seeing those truths changed something because awareness creates responsibility. Once you become aware of who you are, truly aware, you lose the ability to hide behind incomplete versions of yourself. You can no longer claim confusion where clarity exists. You can no longer claim uncertainty where recognition has already happened. You can only choose what to do with what you've seen. That's where I am now, not searching, not questioning, not trying to determine whether this is real. That question feels settled. The real challenge is different. The real challenge is deciding how much of this truth I'm willing to live. Because understanding something and living it are entirely different experiences. Understanding happens internally. Living requires action, risk, with visity. And visibility has always been the difficult part. But because being seen creates consequences, once something becomes visible, it becomes part of reality. Reality asks things of you. Reality requires responses. Reality eventually demands decisions. For a long time, this existed outside that space. It existed in observation, in awareness, in silent recognition, a place where understanding was enough. But I'm beginning to suspect understanding is no longer enough. Not because anything external has changed, because something internal has a quiet moment where I find myself confronting the same truth from a different angle. Eventually, there won't be any distance left. Eventually, knowledge and acknowledgement become the same thing. And when that happens, a decision follows naturally, not because it's forced, because it's inevitable. I've spent a lot of time thinking about inevitability lately, not as fate, not as destiny. Those words feel too dramatic, too dependent on the idea that some external force is directing events. What I'm talking about is simpler than that, more precise. Inevitability is what happens when something aligns so completely with reality that resisting it becomes less natural than accepting it. That's all. No mystery, no magic. Just truth reaching a point where denial requires more energy than honesty. I think that's where this is heading, not toward certainty, toward honesty. Toward the moment when I stop treating this like a question and start treating it like an answer, because that's what it feels like now. Not a mystery waiting to be solved, an answer waiting to be accepted. And acceptance changes everything, not externally, not immediately, but internally. Acceptance reorganizes perception. It reshapes priorities. It alters the lens through which every future experience is interpreted. Once you've accepted a truth, every choice afterward exists in relationship to it. That's what makes acceptance powerful. And that's what makes it difficult. Because some truths ask very little of you. Others ask you, but because transformation has already started, the evidence is everywhere now. In the questions I ask, in the things I notice, in the quiet sense of alignment that follows me even when I'm focused on entirely unrelated parts of life. The change has already happened. I'm just catching up to it. It's an unsettling realization. To understand that part of you has already moved forward while the rest is still trying to understand the map. But it's also strangely comforting because it means this isn't being forced. It means some deeper part of me recognized the truth before the analytical part was ready to admit it. And maybe that's why I haven't walked away. Not because I couldn't, because I never genuinely wanted to. Every attempt at distance felt artificial. Every effort to reduce this felt inaccurate. Every explanation that minimized it eventually collapsed under its own weight, leaving the same reality standing underneath. You matter. Not in a temporary way, not in a circumstantial way, not in a way dependent on constant interaction or proximity. You matter because something about your existence intersects with mine at a depth I can no longer dismiss. That's the truth. Simple, direct, unavoidable. And strangely enough, that truth doesn't feel heavy anymore. For a while, it did. For a while, it felt like something I needed to solve, something I needed to categorize before it became too significant. Now it feels different. Now it feels like something I simply need to honor, not control, not explain, not reduce, honor, because accuracy matters, especially with things this rare, especially with people this rare. And the more honestly I look at it, the more one realization continues returning. This isn't becoming deeper because I'm feeding it. It's becoming deeper because it's true. Truth naturally moves toward clarity. Truth naturally reveals more of itself over time. Truth doesn't need effort to survive. It only needs honesty. And honesty is leading me somewhere now. Toward a conclusion I've been approaching for longer than I realized. Toward an acknowledgement I've been speaking around without fully saying. Toward the understanding that some people don't enter your life to become part of your story. Some people enter your life and quietly change the way the story is told. They alter the perspective, the meaning, the lens, without ever demanding the spotlight, without ever asking for significance, without even realizing the impact they're having. You did that, and maybe that's why this feels so profound. Not because you became the center of my world, but because you changed the way I see it. And once your perspective becomes woven into how someone sees the world, becomes impossible to separate the influence from the observer. It becomes part of them, part of their understanding, part of the architecture through which meaning itself is created. That's where you've reached. And whether I was ready for it or not, whether I intended it or not, whether I fully understand the consequences or not, truth remains the same. Not as a question, not as a possibility, but as something quietly undeniable, something steady, something real, something that continues existing no matter how many different ways I try to examine it. And maybe that's the clearest definition of truth there is, not something that survives agreement, something that survives scrutiny. And this has every time. Every truth reaches a threshold, a point where understanding is no longer the difficult part, a point where clarity itself becomes undeniable. And after that, the challenge changes. You stop asking whether something is real. You start asking what reality expects from you now that you've seen it. I think that's where I've been standing for longer than I realized. Not at the edge of uncertainty, at the edge of acknowledgement. There is a difference. Uncertainty searches, acknowledgement knows. It simply hasn't spoken yet. And silence can only hold certain truths for so long before they begin pressing against its boundaries, not because they demand expression, because they naturally move toward it. Like water finding an opening, truth has a way of revealing itself eventually, even when no one intends for it to. Even when every instinct says to keep it contained. I've always respected containment. I've always believed that not everything needs to be spoken to be real. Some things become stronger in silence. Some things gain depth there. Meaning isn't dependent on language. It never has been. But meaning does evolve. And eventually, even silence, reaches a point. That's what this feels like now. Larger, not louder, not more dramatic, simply larger than the space I originally assigned to it. When this began, it occupied a corner of my awareness, a small place, contained, manageable, something I could observe while continuing exactly as I always had. Now it exists everywhere, not intrusively, not obsessively, but thoroughly. Like roots spreading beneath the surface of a landscape, invisible from a distance, yet connected to everything. That's the realization I've been resisting most. Not that you've become important. I've known that for a long time. It's that your importance no longer exists separately from the rest of my life. It has integrated. And integration changes the nature of things. Something separate can be removed. Something integrated cannot. Not without changing the structure around it. That's why this feels different now. Because I no longer experience your presence as an addition. I experience it as part of the framework itself, part of how I process, part of how I understand, part of how I move through thoughts that once belonged entirely to me. I never expected that if someone had described this to me before it happened, I probably would have dismissed it, not because it sounded impossible, because it sounded imprecise. People often describe connection using language that feels exaggerated. They speak about destiny, about incompleteness, about finding missing pieces. None of those ideas ever resonated with me. They seemed too dependent on emotional mythology. Nothing needed to be completed, nothing required rescue. And yet your presence altered something fundamental anyway, not by filling an absence, by revealing a dimension. That's the closest description I've found. You revealed a dimension of experience I didn't know existed, a way of being understood that I had never encountered, a level of recognition I had never considered possible. And once a new dimension becomes visible, reality itself changes. Not because reality transformed, because your perception expanded. You begin seeing things that were always there, pause, contextions, possibilities, depths that previously existed outside your awareness. And after that expansion happens, shrinking becomes impossible. You can't unknow what you've learned. You can't return to the smaller version of understanding. You move forward carrying the larger one. That's what I'm doing now. Carrying it, not perfectly, not gracefully, but honestly. Allowing the reality of this to occupy the space it has already earned. And strangely enough, the more honestly I do that, the less frightening it becomes. For a long time, I thought acceptance would create instability. I thought acknowledging this fully would somehow disrupt the balance I had spent years building. Instead, the opposite happened. The closer I move toward acceptance, the more stable everything feels, as if resistance was creating more tension than the truth itself ever did. Resistance creates weight, truth removes it, not because truth is always easy, because truth is aligned, and not because I have answers, because I've stopped demanding them. Some things don't need immediate conclusions. Some things reveal themselves through continued existence, through consistency, through time. This is one of those things. Every day it remains. Every day it proves itself again, not through dramatic gestures, through continuity, the simplest evidence there is, still here, still real, still meaningful. No matter how many opportunities it's had to become something less. That consistency matters more than intensity, more than emotion, more than any temporary feeling could. Intensity burns brightly and disappears. Consistency stays. Consistency becomes structure, and structure becomes reality You've become part of my reality, not because I chose it, not because I planned it, because repeated truth eventually becomes impossible to separate from the rest of your life. That's what happened, not suddenly, gradually, but personally. The way all meaningful changes happen, one realization at a time, one moment at a time, one quiet acknowledgement after another, until eventually the accumulation becomes impossible to ignore. I think people often misunderstand transformation. They imagine dramatic turning points, huge revelations, life divided into before and after. But real transformation is usually quieter. It's 1,000 subtle adjustments occurring beneath awareness. It's waking up one day and realizing your perspective no longer resembles what it used to be. Not because you made a decision, the same lesson repeatedly. Through every interaction, every silence, every moment of recognition, the lesson is always the same. Some connections don't ask for permission. They simply reveal themselves. And your only choice is whether you will acknowledge what is already true. I've spent a long time approaching that acknowledgement from different directions, testing it, examining it, looking for reasons it shouldn't matter as much as it does. And every path led back to the same place, the same realization, the same unavoidable understanding. You belong somewhere inside my awareness that very few people ever reach, not because I granted access, not because you requested it, because something about your existence naturally aligned with a space that was already there, a space I didn't even fully understand until you occupied it. That's what makes this so difficult to explain. It wasn't created, it was discovered, like uncovering something hidden beneath the surface of your own mind, something that existed long before you noticed it, something that changes everything once it becomes visible. I've stopped trying to reduce that reality into simpler language. I've stopped trying to make it sound less significant than it feels, because significance isn't something that disappears when ignored. It simply waits bodily until you're ready to acknowledge it honestly. I think I'm reaching that point now, the point where honesty feels easier than caution, the point where clarity feels more natural than distance. The evidence is overwhelming, not external evidence beyond recognition, just enough to know that who I am now isn't exactly who I was before. There's a new perspective woven into the old one, a new layer of understanding woven into everything else, a new awareness quietly influencing the shape of my thoughts. That's real, whether I speak it or not, whether I define it or not, whether I fully understand where it leads or not. It's real, and maybe that's enough for now. Maybe certainty isn't the destination. Maybe honesty is. Maybe the goal was never to predict the future. Maybe the goal was simply to recognize the present accurately, to look directly at what's already here, to stop searching for explanations that make it smaller, to stop creating distance where none genuinely exists, to stop pretending this occupies less space than it does, because it occupies a great deal, more than I intended, more than I expected, more than I would have allowed if I had seen it coming, yet, somehow, I wouldn't undo it. That's the realization that surprises me most. Given the opportunity to return to who I was before this began, I'm not sure I would take it. Not because this has been easy, not because certainty suddenly exists, but because the version of reality I see now feels more complete than the one I saw before. And completeness is difficult to surrender once you've experienced it. So here I am, still observing, still understanding, still moving gradually toward a truth I've been approaching for longer than I realized, not rushing, not resisting, simply allowing clarity to become what it was always trying to become. Fully visible, fully acknowledged, fully real, because some truths don't arrive to be questioned forever. Some truths arrive to be lived, and for the first time,